Hi everyone, my name is Grace and I am a PhD student at Harvard University. I'm super excited to be here with you all today. To help us get started, I want to tell you a little bit about something that happened to me last week. So I was finishing up in lab, the sun was still out, and so I decided to go for a walk. And while I was on this walk, I saw some pretty amazing things. The first thing that I saw was a gray squirrel, and I bet a lot of you have seen one of these before. I also saw a couple of different kinds of ferns. I saw a blue jay, which was pretty cool. I saw this really pretty pink flower called swamp milkweed. And I also saw a green stink bug. So the reason that I'm telling you this is because I think it's pretty amazing to go outside and on one walk see all of these different plants and animals. But it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. We could imagine a world in which there aren't all of these amazing plants and animals and other living creatures. We could imagine a world where there's only one kind of living creature. In fact, we could imagine a world where there's only squirrels. So instead of having lots of different kinds of plants and animals, we only have squirrels. But of course, we don't live on Squirrel World, we live on Earth, where we have this amazing diversity of plants and animals and other living creatures. Now, you might be wondering, well, why are there so many different kinds of plants and animals and other living creatures? If we can imagine an alternative world where there's only one kind of living creature, why do we see so many here on Earth today? And if you're thinking about this question, you're not alone. Scientists have been wondering about this for centuries. And one way that scientists answer this question is to recognize that living things change over time. So given enough time, meaning many, many years and lots of generations, living creatures become different from each other. So in this example, in the past there was only one kind of squirrel, but over time, as they became different from each other, there now are two kinds of squirrels. And in fact, on Earth today, we see 289 kinds of squirrels. That's a lot of squirrels. And although I think squirrels are pretty cool, I actually don't study them. I study a group of living creatures called flowering plants. So this is any plant that makes a flower. You're probably familiar with some of them already. And the reason that I'm interested in this group is because there are lots of different kinds of flowering plants. In fact, scientists think that there are over 369,000 kinds of flowering plants. That's pretty mind-blowing. And one of the reasons that scientists think that there are so many different kinds of flowering plants is because of their interactions with pollinators. So here I'm showing you a butterfly, but a pollinator could also be a bird or a bumblebee or even a bat. When I say that flowering plants have interactions with pollinators, what I mean is that flowering plants rely on pollinators in order to reproduce to make more plants. So the way that this works is that pollinators visit flowers, and when they're visiting flowers, they get pollen on their bodies. So here I am showing that as little yellow dots. When the pollinators move to the next flower, they deposit those pollen. So the pollen gets off of their body and lands on another flower. So this movement of pollen from one plant to another plant by the pollinator is the first step in reproduction. And once that happens, the plant can make seeds, which will go on to make more plants. This process is important for reproduction, but it's also important for another reason. If we were to look inside of these pollen grains, we would find DNA. And you might have learned about DNA before, but I'll remind you that DNA is the material inside of all living things that contains the instructions for how to look and function. So you and me and your teacher and squirrels and pollinators and flowering plants all have DNA inside of us that tell us to look the way that we look. And remember when I told you that living things change over time? Well, I didn't give you the whole story. Because as living things change over time, their DNA also becomes more different. So in fact, as living creatures become more different from each other, there are more differences in their DNA. And one way that we can tell how different two living creatures are from each other is by looking at the number of differences in their DNA. And I do exactly this. I look at differences in DNA of wildflowers that grow in Texas. So I want you first to imagine one scenario. So in this case, there are two populations of flowers living really far apart from each other in Texas. But there's a pollinator that moves pollen between these two populations all the time. So remember that it's also moving DNA between these two populations all the time. So our prediction is that over time, these two populations will remain similar and their DNA will remain similar to each other. But we can imagine a different scenario. So imagine that there are these same two populations, but in scenario 2, the pollinator doesn't move pollen between the two populations. What this means is that DNA is not moving between these two populations. So what's our prediction? Over time, do you think that these two populations will become more similar or more different? Well, I think that these two populations will become more different because there's no DNA moving between them. So how can we figure out whether these populations are becoming more different from each other? How can we figure out which of these two scenarios is happening in nature in the real world? Well, we need to go to Texas to take individuals from each of these populations, and then we need to bring them back to the lab so that we can look inside and find out how different their DNA is from each other. And this is exactly my goal as a scientist here at Harvard. The first thing that I did to achieve this goal was go to Texas so that I could get some of these flowers to bring back to the lab. So I'm showing you here a map of Texas. Everywhere that you see a blue dot is somewhere that I went to collect these wildflowers. I'm also showing you a picture of me with a pollinator that I caught because I was also taking careful observations of the pollinators in their environment. On a typical day in the field, I would wake up and look at my map of Texas to figure out where I wanted to go that day. I would then hop in my car and drive around to find these patches of wildflowers. Oftentimes they were growing right on the side of the road, so it was pretty easy to get to them. Once I had found these flowers, I took some of their seeds, brought them back to the lab, grew them up in the greenhouse, and now I'm in the process of getting DNA out of these plants. So let me show you what that looks like. Here are the plants growing in the greenhouse. The first step is to take a leaf from a plant and put it into a tube. So that's what you'll see me doing here. Once I have the leaf in the tube, the next step is to break it open to get all of the DNA out. In order to do this, I need to get the leaf super cold. So I use liquid nitrogen, which helps get the leaf really cold. From there, I use a special tool called a pestle, which I use to grind up the tissue and break it open so I can get the DNA out. This usually takes a while, so let's speed it up. Now you'll see a whole leaf in one tube compared to the ground up leaf in another tube. This is just the first step in finding out if these individuals are similar or different based on their DNA. Now that I've ground up these leaves to get the DNA out, I've sent the DNA off to a special machine called a sequencer, which can help me read what the DNA says. So I can't tell you yet whether these individuals are similar or different, but I'm super excited to find out. In the meantime, I want to leave you with an idea. The next time that you're outside, take a look around at all of the living creatures around you. This is what scientists do all the time. They make observations and notice the things that are going on in the world around them. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with me today, and I'm super excited to take your questions.